Rotarians and many guests who are here today. The much-loved Rotarian, the late Brian Pittman, once said to me, "Four Eyes, whenever you're chairman of the day, make the introduction of the guest speaker as short as possible. We are here to hear he or she, not you." I thank today's guest speaker. Heidi touched on it. He's actually on holidays and had probably every reason to back out of the commitment. He didn't do that, so I thank him on behalf of us all. He will celebrate 17 years in State Parliament on Saturday the 11th. His impressive CV, I think, only has two glitches: Port Adelaide and Liverpool, instead of the Crows and QPR. He is happy to take questions. A phone call of about a week or so ago, he said, "Four Eyes, how long can I talk for?" I said, "Treasurer, as long as you like, but they'll all get up and leave at 2. He is happy to take questions, and I guarantee that we would have at least a half a dozen here, so we're very impressed with the numbers. Rotarians and guests, would you please welcome our speaker for today, the Treasurer, the Honourable Tom Koutsantonis.
Thank you very much, Tony. Yes, I am on leave, and I haven't had leave since Australia Day. And between Australia Day and now, we've had a state election, and I was given the honour of becoming the state's treasurer. And my wife has diligently been building a list of tasks for me to do for my 2 weeks off. So when Tony asked me if I was backing out, I said, absolutely not. I will take the day off and come speak to you here today. I want to acknowledge a few people in the room, first and foremost. I want to acknowledge our former Governor, Sir Eric Neal. Sir Eric is a great South Australian. Of course, you all know that. He is someone who's always quick to give me sound advice, confidential advice, and it's advice that I treasure. Sir Eric, it's good to be with you again today. And of course, to your President, Peter, thank you for being such a lovely host. And Tony, you're your usual self. People talk a lot about South Australia in negative terms, so I thought I'd give you a few stats to start off with, and then I'll talk about what's coming up next. You'd be surprised to know that South Australia, over the last 12 months, has increased its exports by 15%. It's the highest of all mainland states, second only to the Northern Territory. In terms of interstate visitor nights, it has risen by 12% over the last 12 months, compared to 4.7% nationally. We are now the largest onshore producer of petroleum and oil in the nation. Onshore, larger than Western Australia and Queensland. In terms of new private capital expenditure, not government expenditure, private capital expenditure, it is 14% higher in South Australia today than it was a year ago. Nationally, it's 4% lower. State final demand, which is a collection of the state's expenditure and demand, excluding exports, rose 1.4% in the June quarter in South Australia, which was the strongest of all the states in the Commonwealth. Retail trade is up 2.2% in the 12 months to July. And in the most recent September Bankers Say State Monitor Service survey, South Australian business confidence is at its highest level in 12 months, rising 5.4% from 100.4 of the unit that they used to measure to 100.5. Things aren't as bad as you may have read or heard on radio. I believe, and the state believes, and the government believes, that we have a positive economic outlook. Regardless of what your political persuasion is, the election is over. Labor was successful, and now it is time for all of us to become colourblind again and put our shoulders to the wheel to get the state moving. I think our biggest opportunity for growth in this state is the oil and gas sector. Now, I'm also privileged to be, along with Treasurer, the Minister for Mining and Resources. And it is a remarkable growth that has occurred in South Australia. And we have a clear vision for that growth across the next 10 years. A lot of you would have heard of shale gas. Shale gas is a form of a fracture stimulation that occurs in the ground where conventional wells have run dry. Within the rocks, they're able to fracture stimulate those rocks to get new reserves that can be sometimes double, triple what was there conventionally. The Cooper Basin in the state's north has pipelines connecting it to Queensland, Sydney, Adelaide and Melbourne. Basically, 95% of all eastern seaboard gas is imported, and we account for about half of that. So if the gas doesn't flow from South Australia, the lights go out in Sydney. That's how important our resources sector is to the nation. So we want to make ourselves as competitive as possible. And you may have heard talk recently that we are the highest taxing state in the nation. I have some good news for you. Bad news for the Treasurer, good news for you. That's not true. In terms of the oil and gas sector and the mining sector, our royalty regime is the lowest in the country. We charge less ad valorem and less profit tax than any other jurisdiction in the country for our oil and gas sector and our mining sector. Something I, as Minerals Minister and Treasurer, am very, very proud of. And that's why we want to try and make our tax base as attractive as possible for those emerging industries. And the Premier recently released a report, a set of priorities. And the first priority of the government's 10-point economic plan is to unlock the full potential of our resources sector. We see this industry as having a very bright future. I'll give you an example. Mineral petroleum production has quadrupled in 10 years. It used to be $1.6 billion per annum. It's now over $7 billion per annum in South Australia alone. Our record exports are on the back of this mineral production, with 39% of all of our exports now being linked to mineral resources and energy. A remarkable turnaround. The sector generates about $300 million in royalties per annum. Exploration in oil and gas has risen sharply. And of course, as I said to you earlier, we're exporting record amounts of oil. The key indicators of this record level of expenditure of private new capital and mineral petroleum. Is that better? Can you hear me now? There you go. Oh, good, I'm glad. Wouldn't want you to miss a word of what I'm saying. It's very, very important. I gave up paving. My wife thinks I'm speaking to the Reserve Bank. So of all those indicators, South Australia is now seen as a hotbed of the places to invest. I'll give you an example of how good our regulatory regime is in South Australia. Beach Energy. Everyone's heard of Beach Energy, a great South Australian company. They explore in the Cooper-Eromanga basins, which straddle the New South Wales, Queensland and South Australian borders and some parts of the Northern Territory. The likes, why we ever gave up our Northern Territory is beyond me, but we should never have done that. So I was speaking to Reg Nelson and he said to me, I had to buy a helicopter because of you. I said, why did you have to buy a helicopter? Because it is cheaper and more cost effective for me to helicopter people from Queensland into South Australia to use a latrine, because their environmental approvals in Queensland are so restrictive and yours are so easy to use. It is cheaper and quicker for me to buy a helicopter. Now, for me, that was the pinnacle of my ministerial career. Our regulatory processes are so efficient that a company like Beach Energy would rather invest in a helicopter than apply for a licence for latrines in Queensland and helicopter their staff into South Australia to take a piss. And, excuse my language. And I think that is a remarkable example of South Australian can-do attitude. And you hear it in Queensland about a can-do attitude. That is a real-life example, and that was a month ago. Working to keep this climate is very difficult. New South Wales has just announced a moratorium on all exploration of unconventional gas. Victoria has a moratorium in place. I can assure you that as Mining Minister and as Treasurer, there will be no moratorium on unconventional gas exploration in this state. And I will fight people who try to use pseudoscience to argue that fracture stimulation is dangerous. We've been doing that since Tom Playford slept in the swag in the Cooper Basin for 60 years trying to find oil and gas in the north of our state. Many of you might know or remember that we used to import all of our oil from the Middle East and the UK to turn the generators at Pelican Point and at Port Adelaide. And so Tom Playford realised that this was an unacceptable level of risk for the state. So he went out and formed the South Australian Northern Territory Oil Search Company, Santos. And we found oil and we found gas. We built pipelines to Adelaide, to Sydney and to Queensland. And that legacy will be the foundation upon which this state achieves prosperity. I am the custodian of that for the next 4 years, and I'll be doing everything I can to make sure that we take full opportunities in place to make sure we can exploit those opportunities. We're also blessed to have 70% of Australia's copper reserves in South Australia. Why is copper important? Well, there's no commodity in the world that can replace copper. Every time China builds an apartment, they use 1/4 of a tonne of copper. Every urbanising country in the world needs copper. And we have one main competitor, Chile. Chile is the largest producer of copper in the world, surpassing South Australia. South Australia, at the turn of the last century, produced 1/3 of the world's copper. We want to retake that mantle. We produce enough copper every year to build 1.3 million homes. That's the equivalent of rebuilding Adelaide every year. We're also Australia's first iron ore producer. We are now the country's second largest iron ore producer, and Arium, previously OneSteel, are doing great work. They've built a brand new port at Whyalla last year, and they're the only iron ore company in Australia to have built a port with a larger capacity than their reserves. Why is this important? They've built the port larger than they need, which is the reverse of what BHP, Rio Tinto and every other iron ore company do, because they believe so passionately in our reserves that they think they can fill that within 5 years. That's optimism. Of course, you won't read about that in the Advertiser. You won't read about that in the Australian. You won't hear that on our radio networks because it's good news, and good news doesn't sell papers. What does sell papers is, of course, tragedy. In terms of uranium is the commodity of the future. Whatever your personal views are on uranium, I can assure you that I believe we have a moral obligation to find more uranium. We have a moral obligation to export uranium to developing countries, and we have a moral obligation to help those countries convert that uranium into energy. Because energy means we can power schools, we can power hospitals, we can help them build roads and infrastructure. And as they build their economies on the basis of our commodities, they become trading partners. And we become trusted allies. Prime Minister Gillard signed a memorandum of understanding with the former Prime Minister of India to export uranium to India. India is the only country in the world who we are selling uranium to who has not signed nuclear non-proliferation treaties. They can't because of their engagements with Pakistan. Prime Minister Abbott has formalised that agreement. Make no mistake, that formalisation of that agreement speaks volumes to our trust of India. India is the fastest growing economy in Asia. It's the largest democracy in the world. And Australia, and most importantly, South Australia, is now a trusted partner. So when they look to buy their wheat and their barley and their iron ore and their copper and bring their students somewhere safe to get an education, we are front and centre, because we are the one nation in the world that will provide them with the energy that they require to urbanise, to lift their people out of poverty. So don't let anyone say to you that the export of our uranium isn't moral, or that it isn't doing the right thing by our citizens or other citizens, because we are bringing people out of poverty. We are changing the world with what we're doing with our uranium. And quite frankly, as former Premier Mike Round used to say, it's a bloody dangerous commodity. Get it out of the ground and out of South Australia as fast as we can. And if we can turn a profit on the side, well, that's good as well. How many of you have heard of the Braemar province? Braemar is a type of magnetite. It's an iron ore. And the unique aspect of this iron ore, which starts from Broken Hill and heads all the way down to Wallaroo, is that it's the only iron ore in the world that has a continuous grain and consistency from Broken Hill to port. So wherever you mine it, whoever's got the tenement, the iron ore is exactly the same. It's unique. There have been no other types of this deposit found anywhere in the world. So what that means is you can build a slurry pipe. And a slurry pipe, for those of you who don't know, is a pipeline which has water in it or oil, and you can transport iron ore. So mining companies can dig it up at Broken Hill or in South Australia, pour it all into the one slurry pipe, mix it, and it comes out at the other end, and they won't be fighting and arguing about whose iron ore it is. Whatever you've mined is what you get out at the end. It's unique. And the people who started Fortescue Metals, a man called Gordon Toll, he's investing billions of dollars in South Australia to build that pipeline, to encourage that mining. So in terms of the next 10 years, I think it's fair to say that South Australia is going to take its rightful place in Australia as one of the giants of mining. But we've heard it before. We've heard Olympic Dam before. We've heard these promises before. All I can say to all of you in this room is watch this space. Because every time I go to an interstate or overseas oil and gas conference, I keep on hearing the same message. Oh, you're from South Australia. The Texas of the South. The Texas of Australia. And that is the mantle we want to embrace. Why? Because it's a game changer. Chevron, they're in South Australia now, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world. Statoil, the largest oil and gas company in the world, is in South Australia. BP, the second largest oil and gas company in the world, is in South Australia. I'll give you another story about oil and gas. Off our Great Australian Bight near Ceduna, BP, Statoil, Murphy Oil, Santos will be spending $1.4 billion to drill 4 holes. 4. Not thousands of holes, 4 holes, looking for oil off our shores. People might not know this, but the Great Australian Bight and Antarctica split at one stage, and there was a massive inland sea in South Australia, and all those nutrients poured into the ocean, and they settled at the bottom of the Australian Bight. And thousands of years later, we're going to uncover massive reserves of oil and gas. The largest vessel ever made is off our shores doing seismic surveys looking for oil and gas. The rig that's going to be drilling those holes has already been built in Korea and it's on its way. It costs $600 million. BP and Statoil have already invested over $500 million to find this oil, and when they find it, they'll be employing South Australians. They'll be based here in South Australia, probably in Port Adelaide and Ceduna. They've already placed an order for $250,000 worth of helicopters to be based in Ceduna. So, Cooper Basin, offshore oil and gas, copper, iron ore, and uranium. Does anyone still really believe that we are the basket case of the nation? 95% of Queensland's, of New South Wales' gas is imported, as I said to you earlier. They have a policy of stopping exploration for gas. We are the ones keeping the lights on in Sydney. We are the ones powering commerce and the financial sector on the eastern seaboard. Without us, Sydney would stop working. That's how powerful and important this state is becoming. And I just want to finish off with a few anecdotes that I've heard internationally about our resources sector. We offer mining companies a discount royalty rate when they start a new mine, 2%. So if you find a copper mine or a gold mine or an iron ore mine, we charge a 2% ad valorem royalty. Do you know what the rate is in Western Australia? 12.5%. And in Queensland, it's 14%. Everywhere I go, people talk about South Australia as being the most cost-competitive mining jurisdiction in the world. And I'm very proud of that. And we'll fight to keep it. And yes, I understand that some taxes are high. Things like stamp duties and land tax, yes, they are higher than the national average. But the taxes that encourage business, payroll tax and mining royalties, are the lowest in the country. And I think those two lost opportunities in terms of revenue as a treasurer are well worthwhile in terms of the stimulus that they afford us in terms of the mining industry. I believe that with unconventional gas and the offshore oil and gas, what you will see is a transformation of our state. I'm happy to take some of your questions about any of the statistics that I've raised with you today, or about any matter in relation to the State Treasury, or of course your emergency services levy bill you may have received. Thank you very much for hearing from me. I think what we're talking about is radioactive waste and bringing it back. South Australia has a policy of using our own waste, storing our own waste. The question the gentleman is posing is, will we take Australia's waste and we will take international waste into South Australia? Oh, we look after our own waste. We take care of that centrally. The question we'll have to pose ourselves over the next 10 years is, as our uranium increases in terms of exports, the only way to be completely assured that it's not being used or weaponised is that we take the waste back. That's the only way we can assure that our uranium is not being enriched to be made into weapons. We have a policy of not doing that. And the reason we don't is because South Australians and Australians aren't ready for it yet. When they are, there'll be a young political leader like me who will stand up and make hay while the sun shines. Until that time comes, we don't have the social licence for it. So I apologise. I know what you're saying. I think you and I are probably on the same wavelength on this, but South Australians are not ready for it.
The front page kid.
it's a very powerful argument, isn't it? But this is what would actually happen if we did. The first thing that would happen is that the uranium coming out of the ground would be linked to international prices. So we wouldn't have the cheapest power in the world. The cost of building a nuclear power station is cost prohibitive, so no private company will ever build it. And you're competing with gas. So, when I say you're competing with gas, what does that mean? Over the last 50 years since Tom Playford went up to the Cooper Basin, this state has produced 5 trillion cubic feet of gas in 50 years. Unconventional gas is about to unlock 500 trillion cubic feet of gas. 500. That's the equivalent of powering the Asia Pacific for 100 years. Uranium can't compete. It's not cost competitive. But I understand we have a lot of resource, but if you compared gas to uranium, we have more gas than we have uranium. That's why. Sure. Thank you, John. Port Bonython is Santos's export facility for oil, and there's been talk about expanding that port. The problem we have in South Australia is that there are many iron ore and oil and gas plays going on. So which port expansion goes first? Now, they're privately owned by Flinders Ports, and Flinders Ports' argument is this: when demand is there, we will expand it. We won't expand it in anticipation of demand like one still have with Airport in Whyalla, which is very disappointing to the government. So as Treasurer, I have to consider whether we incentivise the building of a port. So what does that mean? Do I underwrite tonnage for the first person to say to me, I need a new port somewhere, and take on Flinders Ports? But John, in my experience, government's very bad at running businesses. We'd be no good at running a port. We'd probably make a loss. We'd probably be paying people to work 8-hour shifts rather than 12-hour shifts. I'd much prefer a private consortium build a new port or upgrade it. But it is very frustrating for the government. But ultimately, I think it's going to take taxpayer intervention.
Treasurer, I promised you a bottle of Grange, but...
Liar.
The club drunk them all last night at the John Howard book launch, so we've got a Rotary book for you.
Oh, much better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer. That was most enjoyable, most enlightening, and particularly pleasant in the fact that you've made John Hunter's day and indeed year. I'm not too sure the last time John was referred to as a gentleman.